coming out tonight. It's great to see so many faces. Apparently this is a very good turnout, so I'm quite humbled. I hope you can all stay awake. Okay, so my topic this evening is supporting biodiversity in drying times. And note that I didn't say in drought. I think we are well and truly over that notion that this is just an oddity and things are going to return to what they were before. We are seeing increases in temperature, increases in extreme weather conditions, extensions of heat waves, as we saw in February, well earlier this month. And all that has a profound effect on plants, animals, fungi and other creatures that we share the planet with. So I suppose some people might like me to give them a definition of biodiversity. Or maybe we could make this an interactive evening and somebody can shout out what they think biodiversity is.
Life.
Life, okay. That's nice and general. Yeah. Well, variety, that's good. Yeah, variety. So the systems. Wow, I shouldn't have stopped. Helen, do you want to?
Give her the mic.
Yeah, so it's a lot of people have a few different ideas about what biodiversity is, but yes, it's the range and variety of creatures, plants, protozoa, fungi that coexist on the planet with us, that form these amazing systems that help support life. And it's important. It's important to have this great variety of life because we get so much from it. We get things like medicine, we get things like clean water, clean air. Again, maybe I should throw it over to the audience. Anybody else think what biodiversity provides for us? It's a bit like that bit in Monty Python, Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us?
Our food.
Food, yeah, food.
Fire energy.
Yes, yes. Nutrient cycles, nitrogen, carbon, etc., etc. Yeah, it's really important, and unfortunately we're seeing collapse of biodiversity across the planet at the moment. I will cheer you up later on, but I hope to some extent. But I'm thinking an example of when we lose one species, just the follow-on effects. And there's an example of a little whelk, a mollusk that feeds off algae on seagrass in, I think it's Chesapeake Bay, in the eastern United States. And that was lost from the system, and the seagrass died because the whelk was removing the algae from the surface of the seagrass leaves, enabling it to photosynthesize. Once the leaves were covered in the algae and other sediments, it couldn't photosynthesize, so it died. So all those creatures, and I think there was a substantial fishery that relied on those grasses, collapsed as well. So you lose what you think is one insignificant part of these systems, and it can have the most phenomenal flow-on effects. So what we're seeing in our local landscape, the decline of the health of vegetation communities, just a reduction in the number of plants and animals. So any time a bit of clearing goes on, or even like slight modification of landscapes, we're reducing creatures, or plants and animals' ability to live and utilise that landscape. As I mentioned before, we're seeing increased extremes in weather events. So not just 1 or 2 days of very hot weather per year, but extended days and nighttime temperatures too, not cooling down. This is a real stress on plants and animals. And so what does that mean, having a stress on a plant and animal? Well, it leaves them more vulnerable to things like disease, predation, and of course just a loss of water like anybody. If you go without water for 3 days, it's sort of pushing up the daisies time. So that loss of habitat too. think quite a good analogy for loss of habitat is to think of the resources that a tree provides. So big mature tree, lots of hollows. If that's pushed over, people often say, oh well, the animals that are using that, they could move on to another tree, forgetting that perhaps other trees in the area are already inhabited. So if you think of it in terms of a human, it's like a builder coming up to you in your house with a bulldozer and saying, yeah, I've just got to push this over now, but it's all right, because I'm going to build you a new one, and it'll be ready in 200 years. Okay. Connectivity is the other term there. So we're talking about the way that animals move between patches and resources in the landscape. And depending on the scale you're thinking of, like because we're human size, we often think of animals having the same abilities that we do in terms of being able to move from place to place. But if you're a very small animal, it doesn't take the clearing of much of an area before it's difficult for you to move across that landscape. So, for example, something like a threatened woodland bird, like the brown tree creeper, it won't move across an open area greater than 300 metres. Now it's quite surprising probably you think of a bird, they can fly for miles and miles and miles, but the open areas leave them exposed to predation. So they've got to be careful about how they move through the landscape, and they need this connectivity. So even at that scale, 300 metres for a medium-sized bird, it's too great an area to cross. And then, so if you think about things that are even smaller, like a skink, this sort of sized animal, it's really important that we retain fallen timber and long grasses, those sort of things for animals of that size to move through.
Question, Tim. You said the tree creepers are 300 metres. That would be uncommon for birds, though? A lot of birds would be able to travel further, or is that not the case?
Well, not for that sort of size and smaller woodland birds.
Sure, yeah.
If you're talking about things like ducks or waders or birds that are used to flying long distances, no, that's not an issue. But smaller birds that are likely to be predated by either larger birds or other things. Cats, did somebody say? Yes, cats. Yeah, it's a real issue. So safety is something. We barely think about it unless we're worried about snakes. But safety it's a primary issue for a lot of animals, even if you're a predator, because it's the difference between whether you're going to live long enough to breed or not. Degradation of remnant vegetation. So this sort of happens when people go in to collect firewood in woodland remnants, or landholders decide they've got to tidy up a bit of bush because it looks messy, not realising that mess is really essential, as I mentioned before, to a lot of these creatures, how they move across the landscape, utilising resources. So particularly things like fallen timber, it actually keeps the soil under the timber moist, so you'll often find seedlings germinating in those sort of protected areas. It's a really good hiding place for small invertebrates, so they're fed on by small reptiles and small mammals, and in turn birds might come in and pick up small insects from those areas too, so really important component of a woodland or a remnant. The other thing that happens is if stock are let into these woodlands, then they will graze the grass down quite low. And what happens then is we have a native bird called the noisy myna, which is a honey-eater. A honey-eater is an Australasian family of birds. We have a great deal of them, but the noisy myna is the only one of them that actually walks. All the rest of them hop. So the noisy myna walk around these low grazed remnants, and it can see predators creeping up on it because they're nicely grazed and all the fallen timber's been removed. It's an oversimplified habitat. And the thing about the noisy myna is if they get in family groups of above 6 individuals, they become really aggressive and they will drive out any bird smaller than themselves, and quite a few birds that are larger than themselves as well. So you get these quite sterile systems where you only have birds like noisy miners, rosellas, butcherbirds, magpies, currawongs, and all those other smaller birds. Just aren't the resources there anymore, plus they're being outcompeted and they're being driven out by aggression. Alteration of hydrology. So what I mean by this is that we're building a lot of dams across the landscape. We're altering the flows, the natural flows of streams. We're preventing water getting into natural waterways. And of course you're basically drying out the landscape. You hear people say, oh, we're providing all these dams, it's really good for wildlife. And situating a water source in the middle of a bare paddock is not the best way to provide water for animals. As I mentioned before, crossing those open areas, they don't want to expose themselves to danger, and that's exactly what they would be doing if they had to find their water in these new sources. Okay, so that was the depressing bit. Now I hope to sort of lift the mood a little bit. We're going to be able to do something about this, folks. So I'll talk about watering points. I'm sort of thinking that most of you live in town, and we're talking about sort of backyard situations, but some of you might live on properties out of town. So I'll do a little bit of talking about both those scenarios. I'll also talk about shade and shelter and how important that is, of course, to reduce water loss and prevent animals overheating. This is more an out-of-town thing, but wildlife gates, we see more and more fences going up all over the place, and particularly now these exclusion fences where landholders are getting very, very edgy about total grazing pressure. And I would say that a lot of this grazing pressure is really associated with over-exploitation of the land. We've got to stop thinking of grazing as something natural the way we do it now. We put creatures into a paddock, graze a paddock down, take those creatures away. All the nutrients that were taken out of those plants goes away too. So we're primarily mining the ground. That's what grazing is. And you remove those creatures from those systems. So what was I saying? Well, people are blaming native herbivores for these sort of issues, hence putting up exclusion fences. But really, it's a matter of we're not treating the land well enough, and we're not putting back what we're taking out. And we've been doing this taking away for a long time now. So we really need to think more about conditioning the landscapes that we use for grazing. Creating hollows, I mentioned earlier that analogy of knocking down a tree being pretty much the same as knocking down your house. So hollows are really, really important in the landscape. Many creatures use them. How about we do the audience participation again? Give me a name of something that uses a hollow.
Galahs.
Bats. Yeah. Microbats, excellent. Snakes and kingfishers. Fabulous, yeah. Getting a lot of great answers there. Pardalotes. Yeah, there's a real range of animals. Birds, mammals, reptiles. That are dependent on hollows, either as roosting spaces or for breeding. So we can do something about this. And for those of you living out of town on properties, I'll talk a bit about creating a little bit of structure in your dams or wetlands to help increase biodiversity in those environments. Okay, so probably the easiest thing you can do is to put a watering point in your backyard. It's as easy as putting up a bird bath. This is in my backyard. This is a pedestal bird bath. So the key with providing water for birds is it doesn't have to be deep. In fact, deep can be dangerous because birds can drown. And it's best to put it near shelter, so small shrubs, overhanging trees, so the bird can fly in, have a look around for danger, make sure the environment is safe, and then just drop down into the water. So I've put this next to, on one side there's an acacia, on the other side there's a fig tree. A lot of, all sorts of sized birds come in to use this water. Just as a precaution, I would say that you can't just leave the water in and walk away. You need to be a little bit vigilant about your water, because birds can be a little bit messy. They like to bathe in the water, they like to drink the water, but occasionally they'll poo in the water. So it's really best to change the water once a day. So because it's on a pedestal, it's not terribly useful for things like the possums that you might have in your backyard, or you might have blue-tongued lizards, you might have snakes. Did somebody say snakes? Yes, it's going to be tricky for a snake to get up the pedestal over the top there. So, so you could use something larger, which I'll show a picture of in a tick, or something closer to the ground. I've got, I think, probably about 5 receptacles around my backyard with water in, a couple of pedestal bird baths, and a couple of things on the ground too. And if you're out of town, or you're an absentee landholder with a bush block, you might want to think about having some sort of automatic top-up system, so I'll talk about that as well. Okay, so here's your no-frills watering point. Oh, actually, I say no frills, but this bit was quite expensive. That's only after 3 years of using a plastic platter, which finally disintegrated under the UV light. So yeah, so good old upturned rubbish bin there. This brick is so good, it's falling apart now, unfortunately, but it's holding a hose in there, which just has a drip on it, and this stick across the way as well. So it's important that birds are able to perch on the edge of the bird bath too. A bit more confident about coming in if they've got something to perch on. Anyway, very easy. I hope you all go home and make one this weekend.
Not easy on the eye though.
Yeah. Well, you can paint it.
You can green garbage.
These are some examples of, well, this is, I don't think these are exclusively for wildlife. These are more sort of backyard ponds, but they work really well for wildlife. And filling up a bathtub means you don't have to put so much water in so often. And if you've got water plants in there, then they're doing some degree of cleaning that water. I like this one here because it's up against the wall, so obviously critters could come along that can't climb up the bath or fly in and get a bit of water that way. I like this one because it's got a stick in, so things can perch and then walk down into the water. Anyway, that's some interesting ideas there.
Can I ask you about mosquitoes? Because I have water out in my garden for things and the mozzies get into it, and I'm not really keen on providing them with habitat.
Oh, okay, well we've just had a suggestion about goldfish. The other thing you could do is get one of those little solar-powered pumps, because moving water is supposed to deter, to some degree, mosquitoes. Put up some bat boxes, some micro bat boxes in the backyard, so that bats come along and eat the mosquitoes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is a solution where you're not there every day and you can't top up the water for the birds. This little container, sort of automatic trough, just works on a really simple floater system, as you'd probably have in your cistern in your toilet. So once the water drops to a certain level, if you've got a hose attached, you obviously have the hose switched on, but it only fills once that floater's dropped. And then of course you build it and they will come. So next topic, shade and shelter. Anybody want to tell me what these trees are? Yes, Kurrajong. You know, it's extraordinary. You type Kurrajong into Google Images and they're just rubbish pictures. I'm going to have to go out and take some nice photos of Kurrajongs because they just don't do them justice. Anyway, so the interesting thing about about Currajongs and why I've related it to shade and shelter is because, unlike eucalypts, or generally eucalypt leaves hang sort of horizontal to the on their sides, so they let more light in. The leaves of the Currajongs provide much more shade, so much cooler within a Currajong. And koalas love Currajongs for this reason, much cooler up a Currajong than in a eucalypt. And also they're very good foliage, fodder trees, as you can see, they've all been chewed to within a certain height. Oh. Okay, so cover is the key. I did a lot of Googling when I was doing this presentation, and I've Googled First National to find this wonderful image. So this is not an example of biodiversity. Might have a couple of crickets and maybe a lawn grub or two, and then maybe a magpie will come in to eat the lawn grub, and then you'll be back to a couple of crickets.
It does have disability access, though.
Yes, that's right. If you're a magpie that's been totally obliterated by heat stress, you can get wheeled up the ramp there. So great starting point, of course. We shouldn't be negative about this. This opens up all sorts of possibilities, but at the moment, for biodiversity. So cover is the key. Plus, cover at lots of different heights as well. So we've got, in this example, we've got the eucalypt, we've got lots of shrubs, and we've got a few rocks as well, plus the water there. So a nice variety. So I mean, that could become that, just takes a bit of work. The other thing to think about, this is something my housemate hates, is leaving a little corner of the garden a little bit messy.
A little bit.
It's amazing what comes up. I stopped mowing this little patch out the front of my house and now my housemate is very embarrassed about this. But remarkable, I was amazed at the number of native grasses that came up. I got red stem grass, I got wallaby grasses, I got Spirobolus, rat's-tails grass. What else did I get? Anyway, it was remarkable because I thought it was just phalaris and I don't know, buffalo grass, whatever the normal lawn grass is. So you might be surprised. Just stop mowing for a bit, see what happens. But again, really good because you've got all those lovely flowering grasses with the seeds. Brings in the finches. I have had diamond firetails in my backyard, not for a while, but I have had them there. And they are particularly reliant, it's a little threatened native finch, particularly reliant on native grass seeds. They don't do well on the introduced seeds. And of course provides a nice bit of cover for all your snakes. So that gets the tick of approval. Okay, now I've got my Latin pedant hat on, different substrata. I'm not saying substrates. I had a lecturer at uni that used to say, no, a substrate is the site on a protein where an enzyme sits. So we can't say substrate, we have to say substrata, meaning all these different sorts of cover that animals utilise. So just in order to increase the biodiversity in your backyard, you could bring in, or well, not necessarily bring in, but retain a little fallen timber. And you'd get is that a tree teller? What's that one?
I think it's Christmas Morales and marble gecko.
Oh. Thank you, Ray. Marbled gecko. Beautiful little beastie. And what tends to happen, it's not hard and fast rule, but particular species do like particular sorts of cover. So you get your small geckos that really like the wood, and in fact frogs as well. We'll use hollows in wood. You get the critters that like the corrugated iron. If you put a couple of sheets of corrugated iron down, initially it'll encourage ants, but then it'll bring in other things, that S word again, snakes. Terracotta tiles, also good for skinks, and rocks if you have them. Just try not to throw them out or sell them. Keep them in the yard. Really good for those smaller reptiles. And of course, a whole load of associated insect and invertebrate prey. So just a little bit on fencing again. In order to make them a bit more permeable, or our landscape a little more permeable, you can erect wildlife gates, and there are many different styles out there. There are some really simple things, like just having 2 strainer posts at a particular distance apart, and then another post just ahead of it. And apparently sheep don't like that at all, they won't go through, but other native wildlife is more than happy to use that sort of gap in the fence. This chap here is building, I think it's a wombat gate, which is pretty effective, and of course wombats are renowned for doing terrible damage to fences. So situating the gate is the key to success. Really make sure you know where the wombat's getting through in your fence, and then put your gate in. I've seen another style of gate where they've used about 3 logs instead of the solid wood there, and that was for echidnas. It seemed a bit unusual, but apparently that's what echidnas like, logs to push under. So increasing that permeability in the landscape really important, because animals need to move about to find resources, particularly these larger, I'm talking about larger herbivores. If we're talking about small animals, it's not such an issue, they just go straight through the wire. So we can install nest boxes and create hollows. As I said before, a really important resource, and we all called out, or nearly all of us, called out a species or 2 that we knew that utilised hollows. So a simple way to do it is just to buy a nest box, and there are a whole load of nest boxes that you can either buy or of course make yourself. Plenty of plans on the net, easy to find. So you get small boxes for pardlotes, deep boxes for parrots, long boxes for kingfishers, specially shaped boxes for microbats, all sorts of available. It's best to cater to the animal that you think you want to attract, and they are usually fairly readily taken up. I bought a possum box, I think about 15 years ago. No, I didn't buy a possum box, sorry, I've ruined that story now. I bought a wood duck box. Now we all know the end of that story. The wood duck didn't use it, but a possum did. So I've had a possum who successfully raised a joey for at least the past 6 years that I know of. She moved in there after we got rid of the bees, which were the initial coloniser. The ducks came and had a look, but they didn't fancy it. Yeah.
We put up a possum box and ended up with wood ducks. So.
You've got my wood duck.
House swap. You could do a swap.
So this is a nice little sort of, I don't know if it's been used, it looks a bit bizarre, doesn't it? But anyway, shows you the range of nest books that you can either make yourself or you can purchase. I think that's becoming more and more apparent is that we need to think about thermal insulation. Nest boxes are usually sort of made out of relatively thin plyboard, so they don't provide much shelter in the heat or warmth during the cooler months. However, using a live tree or even dead standing timber and cutting a hollow within that wood provides much better insulation and therefore much better protection for the animal. And here we have a sugar glider taking up residence in a box, and an eastern rosella using one of these specially created. Interestingly enough, at CSU they've started 3D printing nest boxes. I'm just going to give you a second to read that, because I know that if I'm talking and people are reading, they're not listening to what I'm saying. Rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. So that was Dave Watson down in the Albury campus of CSU posted that. Oh, no, he didn't post that. CSU Green did, but they included Dave. So you can see a number of different shapes, and the interesting thing is the profile, the slice through. So this, again, thinking about increasing thermal capacity. So I don't really know how it works, but I assume that these sort of layers help circulate air, and you've got the double wall to provide extra insulation. Some of you may know Mick Callan. He's currently doing, I think he's doing an honours, and this is part of his honours course. So there he is with the box and installing it up a tree, I beg your pardon. So for those of you who are out on the land, you might have a farm dam. I'll start this little story with a landholder south of Dubbo who got in touch with me and said, "Come out, see my place, see what we're doing." So we went out. He said, "Look, I've got these 2 dams, and I'm going to throw some kumbungi up that end, and I'm going to put Phragmites down there, and I'm going to have a board out here, and I'm going to do